Hello, everyone. So, I am going to go over the history instructions for week 3 of our distance learning. So, on Google Classroom, you are going to go to our history course and scroll down to the bottom where it says distance learning week 3. We're going to go over this article right here, King Cotton and Life in the South. So, here's what you are going to do. So, the directions are mark the text using the marking the text nonfiction document. When finished, create a brief summary using the following information you circled, underlined, and annotated. Then answer the following questions that follow. So your annotations are going to go here on the side. You are to mark the text. I'm going to read along with this video. Feel free to forward or rewind at your own pace. So I'm going to start. During the 1800s, cotton continued to grow in importance in the South. It was so profitable that Southerners did not feel a need to invest in factories. Even though Southerners grew crops, cotton remained the region's leading export. While industry was growing in some parts of the United States, the South focused on farming. Cotton was the most valuable crop. Its importance helped support the spread of the terrible practice of slavery. Eli Whitney, a young teacher from Connecticut, traveled to Georgia in 1793. He planned to be a tutor on a plantation. At the time, there were few public schools in the South. Whitney was also a tinkerer. He loved to fix things. When he learned of the planter's problem, he decided to build a machine to clean cotton. In only 10 days, Whitney came up with a model. His cotton engine, or gin, had two rollers with thin wire teeth. When the cotton was swept between the rollers, the teeth separated the seeds from the fibers. As a result, this new technology brought economic growth. The South's cotton's kingdom and reliance on plantation agriculture. In the 1800s, the textile industry boomed in the North. The growing factories needed more cotton to make more cloth. Cotton farming in the South expanded to meet this demand. As cotton farming expanded, so did slavery. Cotton became the South's largest cash crop, or crop sold for money at market. Other valuable crops included rice and sugarcane. These crops were costly to raise. Rice, rice was important along the coasts of South Carolina and Georgia. Growing rice and sugarcane required expensive irrigation and drainage system and a warm, moist climate, all found mainly along the coasts. In general, it made economic sense to grow them only on large farms, called plantations. Southern farmers did grow other crops. Tobacco was important in some areas. Tobacco had been an export of the South since 1619, and it continued to be planted in Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. The South also led the nation in livestock production. Hilly areas were devoted to raising hogs, oxen, cattle, mules, and horses. The focus on farming in the South meant there was much less industry than in the North. Many goods were brought from northern factories. There were also fewer cities in the South. Most people lived on farms. Because the South relied on agriculture, most of the industry in the South remained small and existed only to meet the needs of the a, irrigation society. What were the characteristics of white Southern society? Large plantations dominated the South. Those who owned them built grand homes. They held key posts in government. However, only 1 in 30 white Southerners belonged to a family that owned at least 20 enslaved workers. About 75% of white Southerners lived on small farms. They may have owned 1 or 2 enslaved workers and worked next to them in the field. Poor whites often rented the land on which they raised potatoes, corn, and vegetables. They did not own enslaved workers. A planter was someone who owned at least 20 enslaved workers. In 1860, only one white Southerner in 30 belonged to a planter family. An even smaller number, less than 1%, owned 50 or more enslaved workers. These wealthy families were called the cottonocracy because they made huge amounts of money from cotton. Like northern whites, most southern whites were farmers. Most white farmers in both regions were small farmers. However, there were more important differences in the white populations of the two regions. In the South, the wealthiest whites were planters who made their money from the work of enslaved African Americans. In the North, the wealthiest whites were capitalists who made their money from investing in the industry. There were many white industrial workers and middle class people living in cities in the North. Relatively few Southerners of any class lived in the cities. What was it like for African Americans in the South and slavery in the South? Both free and enslaved African Americans lived in the South. Their legal and political conditions were different. Although free under the law with certain legal rights, free African Americans faced harsh discrimination. Enslaved African Americans had no rights at all. In 1860, about 200,000 African Americans in the South were not enslaved. Most were descendants of those freed during and after the Revolution. Others bought their freedom. They lived mainly in Maryland and Delaware, where slavery was less widespread, or in larger cities. Some free African Americans owned businesses. Some even owned enslaved African Americans. But even free African Americans faced legal limits to their freedom in the South. In certain states, they risked being kidnapped and sold into slavery. Most African Americans in the South were enslaved. In fact, 1/3 of the population of the South in 1860 was enslaved. Most worked in farm labor. Many became skilled workers, some skilled in households. Wherever they worked, the day was hard and long. White slave owners did not like free African Americans living in the South. They feared that free African Americans set a dangerous example, encouraging enslaved African Americans to rebel. To discourage free African Americans, Southern states passed laws and limited their freedom and economic opportunities. Free African Americans were not allowed to vote or travel. In some southern states, they had to move out of the state or risk the chance of being kidnapped and enslaved. Enslaved people had almost no rights. Laws called slave codes discouraged them from running away or rebelling. They were forbidden from gathering in groups of more than 3. It was a crime for them to learn to read or write. They could not testify in court against anyone who mistreated them. Families of enslaved African Americans were often broken apart. Still, family provided strength and love in African stories, songs, and morals. Religion was also a source of strength. How did enslaved African Americans resist their enslavement? Enslaved African Americans found ways to resist slavery. Some worked slowly, broke equipment, and even fled to seek freedom in the North. A few led rebellions. In 1831, Nat Turner led his companions on a 2-month-long revolt. As a result of Turner's uprising, many southern states increased restrictions on African Americans. So this section right here, you would have your annotations on this side. You are going to go ahead and write a summary, minimum of 5 sentences of what the text that you read. So right here, number 1, what factors led to the expansion of slavery in the South? So you are going to find the answer. It is on the first section of the article, and or actually not first section. Yeah, the first section, this part right here, all of it. Number 2, it says describe the lives of most white Southerners in the early 1800s. Number 3, what happened to most African Americans in the South at this time? 4, summarize the ways in which some African Americans resisted slavery. So those are the questions that you were going to answer. Remember, do not forget about the summary. And as always, if you want me to go over each individual question with you, feel free to contact me. If not, that is all I have for today, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye, guys.